I'm really excited to be here tonight. We've got some great talks coming up about film yet. Tonight I'm going to be talking about new CSS features, specifically around layout, and some of the cool stuff that's coming out of new specs. So, real quick, before we get into an introduction, I'm Tyler. You can find me on the net as Ty Benz. If you guys want the slides for this talk, you can hit my blog there at tybenz.com. Right after I get done here, I'm going to post a link at the top to the slides for this talk. So if you need any of the examples or anything that I get into, or you want to look at the code in more depth, feel free to check that out. Alright, so what we're going to cover tonight are 4 CSS specifications. Some are available for you to play with in modern browsers. Some of them are coming soon. So we're going to walk through these 4 different ones, and the way we're going to do it is first run through the concepts of each of them. So we'll skip the code, just talk about kind of the motivation, the how, the why, and the what of all these different specs. Then we'll run back through them again, this time in more detail with the code. And then lastly, we'll do a few quick visual demos. So first thing we're going to talk about is the flexible box layout. Flexbox is awesome. It's the first sane CSS layout system that we've seen. So we all, I'm presuming you guys have experience in the web. This is a phone event, but HTML has always had a layout system, but it's really boring. It's blocks, right? Stacked top to bottom, can't do much else. There have been some things in CSS that allow you to kind of hack and get around that to do things like grids or laying things out in a horizontal manner. But Flexbox is the first CSS-only sane CSS layout system. And so what I'm just going to do is kind of walk through how this works. So the idea is we're going to think of it tonight as a one-dimensional layout system. There's a lot more to Flexbox that I'm going to go into tonight, because we're just doing a quick overview. So in fact, with Flexbox, you can actually get your flex items to wrap on multiple lines. But we're going to think of it as a one-dimensional layout system. So the way this works is you align your items inside of a Flexbox into a specific dimension. So in this case, we're looking at horizontal, right? And from there, once you have these things kind of grouped and laid out in a specific dimension, you can arrange them in different ways. So here they're grouped on the left, which is Flex Start. If I change it to Flex End, they're on the right. I have Center. I can tell them to have equal space between, which is always really nice, right? And in this case, they're justified to the start and end of their container. Or I can tell them to have equal space around, so each of them have an equal margin surrounding them. In addition, I can adjust their alignment in the opposite dimension, so the flex dimension in this case would be horizontal, but I can align them vertically a little bit by saying flex start. I can align them to flex end, I can center them, I can stretch, or I can align them on their baseline. So all sorts of tweaks, and this is kind of the core concept behind Flexbox. Now let's talk about some specific things you can achieve with these things. So the first one is vertical centering. So I showed you before that we have a lot of alignment options in Flexbox. You can actually do vertical centering very easy. Now this is a big pain point for people on the web, right? This has been something that's been written about over and over again. There are a lot of hacks out there to get it done, negative margins, transforms, all kinds of things. Now with Flexbox it's made easy, and you notice here's just a quick visual example. I'm just animating the height of the container here, and I have all my Flexbox stuff set up such that my blue box is vertically centered, and it remains that way regardless of the height of the parent. So something that should be really simple in CSS and has been missing, and it's finally here with Flexbox. In addition, we have this concept of flexing. Now this is a weird one, but when we think about one-dimensional layout systems, so I have a set of content inside this container, and oftentimes you're going to find that your default width or height of all the children aren't going to be enough to kind of fill up the space. So flexing is all about filling up the missing space inside your flex container. So I'm going to do a little animated example here. So when I hover over this, we're going to change the width of the container. Now these things have had some properties set on them to allow them to flex. So they have a basic width at the smallest size, and then as they stretch, they're actually stretching themselves to fill up the empty space that would be there in the container. And in this case, there's a ratio. The box on the right is always twice the width of the one on the left. So you can do some funky things like this. So that's another core concept of Flexbox that we missed. Rearranging order is another awesome one. So I've got 3 items lined up with Flexbox, and when I click on this, I'm actually just toggling a single CSS property, and I'm able to switch the order. So since we have this one-dimensional layout, we have a sequence of items, we can tweak that a little bit. All right, next up is the Holy Grail layout. So this is something that's been around for a long time. The idea is simple. When laying out a website, it's often nice and, it's expected UI and layout for our users, right? To have a simple header, a footer, we have some navigation on the left, the aside is on the right, that's usually something like ads, and then we have our article in the middle, and the idea here is that the article should stretch to fill up that space. Well, with Flexbox now, this is really easy to do, right? Our header and footer behave as normal divs, navigation and aside just have their width, and then the article is made to flex. So that middle row, those three items, can just be thrown into a flex container, you add some properties, and your Holy Grail layout is complete. There's no more need for hacks like floats and position absolute or any of that. And there's a ton more you can achieve with Flexbox. These were just a few quick examples of kind of why we need this and how awesome it is. So we'll come back to it and go over the code in a little bit. Let's keep going. So next thing I want to talk about is grid layout. So grid layout is our full two-dimensional layout, and again, this is all in CSS. So the idea here is that we want to define some grid lines just in CSS. And the cool thing here is we can define grid lines almost any way we like. So we can do it with lengths and percentages. So if you think of this grid that I've drawn here on the right as our Holy Grail layout, once again, the navigation and the aside that we talked about in that second row might be defined by some pixel or percentage width. You can define your grid lines based on the content. So for our header and footer and article, they might just be defined based on the content. And then you can have a similar concept of flexing, right? So I want, width-wise, I want my article to always stretch to fill up that missing gap. So in CSS, you sit down, you basically draw a grid with a few properties, and then once you have your content to go into the grid, you grab them and you can actually place them into the grid using a few more CSS options. So here we've placed the header into the first row and told it to stretch all the way across. Our navigation is in the second column, second row, first column. Articles, second column, second row. And then the aside is the second row and the last column. And then the footer stretches all the way across our third row. So we define some grid lines, we place them in there, and now our Holy Grail layout is complete. In addition, you can also tweak the alignment inside each grid item. So you can tweak it in both dimensions. And you can allow things to overlap in the grid. You can place more than one grid item into, or place more than one item into a grid cell. So one thing to note here is that grid implementations are catching up to the spec changes. So there was a version of the grid layout that was implemented in IE10. The spec is updated and it's now not really up to date. There are some demos out there on the net that you can find to kind of get an idea for how this works, but the implementation that's in IE10 now is out of date, and everyone else is in the process of catching up to the new spec. Cool, so let's go over shapes. This is a really easy one, and it's really cool. So we've had floats for a while, and if you've ever floated an image left or right, you notice that content flows around it pretty well, but it does it in a very rectangular way, right? So the idea here is that if I have an item that might be a circle or a trapezoid or whatever polygon I can think of, I can float it, I can define a shape within CSS, and the content that's around it will flow in the way that I expect it to. Cool, regions. Regions is also awesome. This is all about defining where content flows. So it's a little weird when you get down into the implementation, but here's how it works. And actually, I'll show you first kind of one of the use cases for this thing. So I've got this article sitting here on the left, and this red rectangle we can think of as the viewport. So if I have an article and I want it to be responsive, right, it's gonna flex to the size of the viewport as I shrink it. Let me show you what happens. So I'm shrinking the size of the viewport, and you notice that my image is actually getting pushed down out of the viewport. So if it's really important for my content to display this image inside the viewport as soon as the user loads the page, this is kind of annoying, right? What I would really like to do is define a region above the image that has a maximum height, and then allow all of the content, no matter how much width there is, allow the content to flow around the image. So that's what we achieve here with regions. So I have a fixed height above the image, and you notice that the text, as it runs out of room, it flows below. And this is exactly what regions gets you, and it's great for this use case and great for many others. There's a ton of examples that you can find on our web platform site that go through magazine type layouts where you have content flowing and all sorts of boxes around the page. So this is the kind of simple demo. So the implementation, as I said, is a little weird to wrap your head around. So the first thing we do is we want to pull the content from the normal flow of our HTML document and kind of put it off to the side. So they have this notion of named flow. So you can think of putting a label on these chunks of content, and what actually happens when you go to do this is it pulls it out of the page altogether, and it won't put it back in until you define regions for that content to flow in. So we've kind of taken our content from the page and we put it off in this little box, and we give it a name. And then we have our regions. So all we do is we create boxes using CSS and elements as we already know how to do. We define some boxes, and then we add a property that grabs all the content from the named flow and flows it through. So you notice here, my boxes are a little bit different as far as their styling. They're not quite the full width, but my content's still flowing through as I expect it to. So those are the 4. These are the new ones. And what we're going to do now is circle back, run through them again, and this time we'll do the code and go a little bit further in. Let's talk about Flexbox. So to get started with Flexbox, these are the 2 things you need to know. We have the notion of a flex container. So if you have a container around elements and you want them to behave as Flexbox does, you can define display flex or display inline flex. And the default behavior is to align them horizontally. And we'll see a way to change that in a second. So for the actual flex items, the things that the items contain, sorry, I think I'm missing a slide here. Sorry, for the actual flex items, there's no code required. All I need to do is define display flex on my container. Again, I can tweak the direction. So this property is actually flex direction. So by default, it's row, which is horizontal. I can tweak that to column, which would be vertical. And then there's these 2 odd ones, which are row reverse and column reverse. So you can actually flip the order of the elements really easily by using this. Not sure what use cases that shows up in, but it's cool. Flex container distribution. So this is about aligning those items within your Flexbox. So again, I showed that demo at the beginning with all the buttons. This is exactly that. So I can align them to flex start, flex end. You notice that those are called flex start and flex end and not left or right because the dimension can change. So if I had done flex direction column, in this case, flex start would be top, flex end would be bottom. I can center them, I can assign equal space between or equal space around. Similarly, I can change the alignment in the opposite dimension. So in this case, it's row. So when I say align items flex start, that puts everything on top. And I have flex end, center, stretch, and baseline as we saw before. So align items is the property here. So again, this was the slide I was looking for. Flex items don't have any code required. There are some properties that you can assign to flex items to override the parent's default alignment or things of that nature. So again, this is align self to do the override. So you can break whatever the parents defined and have a specific alignment for that single flex item. And then we have the notion of order. So I talked about reordering content within the flex container. If you have a parent who is display flex, you have this order property available to you. And it's a single integer, and it's a simple shift in the order. So -1 will move you back 1, and positive integers will move you that many spaces forward. And then flexing, as we saw before. So this is the same demo. Again, the ratio here is 2 to 1. The idea here is that I want to be able to tell certain elements within my flex container to make sure that they stretch such that all of the children add up to the width of the container. So you notice there's no empty space here. From the left side of the container all the way to the right, I have content filled up. So the way this is implemented, excuse me, green and blue both have a minimum width of 150 pixels. So you notice that the smallest width are actually 150. So that ratio of 2 to 1 is kind of thrown out the window. The flexing only matters when the container is so large that it actually needs to start filling up the void. So in this case, I've got flex set to 1 on green and flex set to 2 on blue. These integers can be anything you like, but the idea is that you end up with some notion of a ratio, right? So blue is always twice the size of 1. So in the basic case of Flexbox, what you usually have are a list of items, and you want one of those items to take up the space, like our example with the Holy Grail layout. So I can set flex to 1 on article, and I'm done. I don't have to worry about the other ones. So here is a modification of that. I can actually also let Flexbox take care of automatically adjusting the margin. So again, I have this similar animation, but you notice this time my margin is being toggled. So if you set any margin property to auto, and you have the flex property set as well, the flexing that it's doing is not only adjusting the width, but it's adjusting the margin rather than the width. So we have a minimum width and a maximum width on these boxes, so you notice that each of them are stretching a little bit in their width, but they also have, green and yellow have margin left set to auto, and blue has margin right set to auto. So it's actually stretching the margin since our width has been capped. So it's kind of an odd example, but it's to show you that there's power in tweaking the margin. Most often with flexing, if you want the margin to be the thing that stretches, you can use space between or space around when defining your justified content. So let's go over vertical censoring. This is really simple. So if I have a flex container, I give it display flex. If I want to vertically censor it and horizontally censor it, I can define margin auto on an individual flex item. Or if you'd like to put all of the properties on the container itself, you need display flex, and you need the alignment properties. You need the justify content center, align item center. So that will center it horizontally and vertically, and you only needed 3 CS properties to do it. And this is built for that, unlike some of the other hacks that we've seen that try to attempt this. Cool, so let's do a Holy Grail styling in Flexbox. So I have 5 elements: header, article, navigation, aside, and footer. So this is what I start with, and again, HTML by default stacks these things on top of each other. So Flexbox can change that. So we take the 3 items that we want to lay out horizontally, we wrap them in a flex container, and we give them display flex. Now you notice that the order is not really what I want. The Holy Grail layout usually has a navigation on the left-hand side and the article in the middle. But since I'm using Flexbox, I can change the order inside CSS. So the next thing I do is I grab a hold of the navigation and I set its order to -1, which will shift it back in the flow. From here, I want to assign a width to the navigation on the side. Notice that they're shrinking to their content. So I can give a minimum width to all of my items inside the Flexbox. But again, I still have the empty space. So here's where flexing comes in. I have this empty space, and I want to tell my article to stretch until that empty space is actually filled. So I define flex 1 on the article, and I'm done. That's Holy Grail layout in CSS only. Cool. So grid layout, this is kind of a bummer, but as I said, the spec is changing, therefore browsers are catching up to it, so there's actually nothing stable enough to even put on the screen in front of you. The basic concepts remain, and the properties will reflect it, but the idea, again, is that you just define grid lines with a few properties in CSS, and then you tell your items where to go into the grid, using things like indexes. Cool, so let's go over the code for CSS shapes. Again, this is all about getting your content to flow around specific shapes. So there's 4 shape values that they've added. Inset is actually an inset rectangle. So the idea here is that you set top right, bottom left, much like you would border width or positioning. And then you have the option to also pass it border radius attributes if you'd like it to be a rounded rectangle. The circle value, you pass it a radius. Again, this time it can be a percentage or pixels or whatever you'd like your radius to be. And then you have the identifier at, and then you have a center X and a center Y. And this is similar to how background images are centered. You can say center, center, 50%, 50%, however you want to position it. And then the ellipse here, again, is a similar thing. We have 2 radii for ellipses. We have horizontal and vertical, and then we have a center for it. And then our polygon is simply just a list of vertices. And these can be defined as percentages, as pixel values, M values, whatever you'd like it to be. And you can go as long as you want and create a very complex polygon. And the browser will make sure to link up the last vertex in your list with the first so that it's a complete polygon. And there's some really cool examples. If you hit Adobe's web platform site, they built some kind of cool magazine layouts where the content is literally fitting inside of these random shapes. In addition, we'd like to be able to extract shapes from images. So this uses the alpha channel path. So the idea here is if I draw a circle in Photoshop and I export it and the rest of it is transparent, I can just use an actual image here and it will pick up the shape and have the content flow around whatever shape happens to be sitting inside the image. So let's go over the two properties that we need to get this done. So shape outside is the property that will pass those shape values that we just went over. So here's an example of some content and an image that's floated left. And again, we have this rectangular way of wrapping the content around, and this is not what we want, right? We have this circular image that looks undesirable, to say the least, that it's wrapping in this way. So shapes to the rescue, we use shape outside, and we use the circle syntax. So 50% is the radius, at, and then 50% would be the position in which the center of the circle is placed. So these are actually the defaults for the circle method, so I can actually take those attributes out. If you need to change them, of course they're there. But in this case, by default, when you use circle, you'll have a 50% circle placed in the center of your item. And this looks pretty good. This looks a lot better. Right now I've got content floating around the image in a more circular pattern. Only thing is it might get a little cramped, so that's what shape margin is for. It gives yourself a little breathing room while respecting that shape. Cool. So let's go over regions. So again, I talked about those named flows. Flow into is the property that creates them. So if we're back at our example here, we have a paragraph, an image, and a paragraph embedded in this article. And again, we have this resizing case where everything is getting pushed down by default. So this is just our starting markup. From here, we're going to use flow into, and we're going to create a named flow. So all of the content inside those paragraphs, because that's what I've selected, is now extracted and off screen into this named flow. And it won't show up on screen again unless I use flow from, which pulls the content out. So flow from creates the actual region. So we're just going to draw some boxes first. So there's an article that came out recently on a list apart that was kind of bashing regions. And it talked a lot about enforcing the idea of non-semantic markup to make these boxes on the screen. There's two counterpoints to that. One is pseudo-elements, always to the rescue. Two, if you don't have enough pseudo-elements, regions is heavily dependent on some of these other layout features that we've covered. So things like Flexbox and grids can kind of avoid some of the pitfalls when it comes to non-semantic markups and using empty divs to draw these boxes. So in this case, we're using pseudo-elements to draw these boxes. We have a display block, and we've defined the height on the box. So now, as I'm resizing, I have a fixed height on the box. And now it's time to just put the content into it. So we use flow from. We have our named flow, which is fill up, and we use flow from to pull all of that content. So we just add it to the before and to the after. Now the content is inside of our boxes, and we get the result that we wanted. So all of the text is flowing around the image. And then, of course, you're able to change the box styling. So in this case, I've altered the width of the top box, and the content flows just the same. So they really are just divs, and the region support is taking care of the content flowing through them. Cool, so let's do a few demos, some more complex stuff. So we just went over regions, and again, it's a lot of this stuff is targeted towards very magazine-like layouts. There's a lot of print designers that show up on the web and they say, why can't you guys do this? This was really easy for us in InDesign. And in print media, it doesn't make sense that it's so complicated in the web. So that's what a lot of these specs are trying to solve, which is why a lot of it has to do with the way text flows, the way it's laid out. There are some examples that people have been putting together for how you can use some of this stuff for more application UI and how to lay things out within your app. So here is an example of some simple navigation. I've got account and language up top. I've got these links down here in the bottom in blue. And what I want to have happen is responsive layout, right? If I shrink the screen down to a mobile screen size, I kind of run out of room to display all that stuff in my header. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck it into this navigation drawer on the left-hand side. Now, all of this is done with CSS. Now, the toggling of the menu is actually JavaScript, but all I'm doing here is using CSS regions to pull all 5 of my buttons, put them into a named flow, and then put the actual content into the navigation along the side. So it's really simple to do with CSS. And again, this is only happening, I have some sort of media query here that's detecting the breakpoint. But the idea is that it's a lot easier to take content that already existed on the page, and instead of hiding it and showing something else, I'm rendering the same content but in a different region, just by using a little bit of new CSS features. So let's do this one. So here's one that I whipped up. This is using Flexbox to display the navigation that's on the left-hand side and the content that's on the right. So I'm using Flexbox to lay these things out horizontally, and I have my Flex1 property on the giant thing that's on the right-hand side. So the idea here is, once again, I can add a little breakpoint, and as I shrink the screen size, I can toggle that flex direction. So by default, flex direction is flow from left to right using row. All I have to do is add a breakpoint with one single property switch, which is just change my flex direction from row to column, and now I've got these things stacked and it's more mobile friendly. Again, there's a little bit of JavaScript in hiding and showing the navigation items, but I just need a little bit of CSS to toggle my layout just with a single breakpoint. So there's a ton more Flexbox examples up on this site called Solved by Flexbox. Philip Walton, he's on GitHub. You can find this link in my slides as well. So you come here and there's a few ones that he walks through. He talks about building a grid system with Flexbox. It's actually really easy to do. Input add-ons such as labels and buttons all coupled together. He talks about the Holy Grail layout and vertical centering. And then there's this notion of the sticky footer. This is also another really common problem in CSS that can get obnoxious. If you've ever tried to implement a footer that will stay at the bottom of the page, even if there's not enough content to push it down to the bottom, it's really annoying to do in CSS. And with Flexbox, this is easy, right? Because we have the notion of flexing. And finally, here's an example that goes through regions, exclusions, and shapes. This is built by CJ Gammon here at Toby. And it's a very content-rich, magazine-like experience, but the idea here is that he's using regions to flow this content through things like this pull quote and the photo here. So you notice as I'm resizing, all this stuff here is being tweaked and controlled. The layout is all controlled by regions and shapes and exclusions. So that's about it. I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys for letting me talk. I think we have some time for questions. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Compare across all of the different browser types.
Sure. Yeah, sorry. Browser support. I needed to go over that. So, really cool about Flexbox. Let me see if I can pull these up here. Flexbox is supported pretty well in browsers. Up to, let's see, it goes back to IE10. And again, some of these are prefixed. But I've actually been using Flexbox pretty extensively in my own projects by using Sass. Urban's got a Flexbox mixin that's coming out. So you can actually get some of this stuff as long as you have your prefixes in order. Go ahead.
Just to follow up on that question, what about WebKit?
WebKit for this spec? Let's see. Safari goes. WebKit prefix goes all the way back to 5.1.
I meant PhoneGap. When I said PhoneGap. Like
oh, PhoneGap. Sorry, so PhoneGap is using WebKit as well, right? So that would go along with the Safari phone.
It seems like a lot of these flexible solutions are, you can also get using Twitter Bootstrap, but does that use JavaScript libraries to solve that problem?
Yeah, well, yeah, so actually, Twitter Bootstrap's grid system is using some of the CSS hacks that I was mentioning. So if you try to build a CSS grid system without Flexbox, it involves a lot of floats and different positioning tweaks. So these are all things that are considered hacks in CSS that are not really built for maintaining a grid system, where Flexbox can do it in a lot less code. Sorry, as far as support goes for grid, as I mentioned, browsers are still catching up to it. It's widely unsupported right now. We expect that to be implemented within the next year, I hope. Shapes you can play with if you have Chrome Canary or Safari, and regions is the same. So WebKit's supporting it. I don't think Firefox has it. IE9 and IE10, or sorry, maybe it's 10 and 11, have regions.
So it's kind of along the line of what you were asking, because I'm thinking that's the same thing. How does this, if I'm using Flexbox, can I expect not to have to use like a Bootstrap or a Foundation, or how does it fit in with those?
Right, okay, so that's a great example. So can Flexbox be a wholesale replacement for something like Bootstrap or, sorry, what was the other?
Foundation.
Foundation, right, grid systems. So yes, it can. If you hit up that link at the here, Philip Waltz installed by Flexbox, he talks about building grids in Flexbox, and it's a pretty small sample of code. So if you can whip one of these up yourself, carry it around from project to project, if all you're using Bootstrap and Foundation for is the grid system, you don't need any more. As long as you're targeting browsers, again, IE10 and newer, and then the modern browsers on the Safari and Firefox side all support Flexbox. You have to worry about prefixes, but precompilers or prefix free can help you with that.
What about for the shapes? Can you explain the example of the shapes with the images at the alpha channel that you were talking about?
Yeah, so
what do you mean by that? And one more question I got is regarding like the performance in general, because I've done a lot of like border radius to create like circles and different kind of shapes, but I know that's like in the box on the performance, especially on mobile devices.
Sure.
So how is shapes performance?
I can't answer that question. Sorry. The shapes performance is a little, it's untested at the moment. So shape support in general is pretty sparse. If you go and try to mess with it, the alpha channel path that I mentioned, where you can extract, using the image, you can extract a shape and use it. It's not even supported experimentally in the browser yet. You can use things like circle and ellipse currently, and I think it's Chrome Canary and WebKit, Safari. But I can't speak to the performance. I haven't seen any extensive benchmarking or testing done with these things to know either way if it's gonna crash or doesn't.
Images, what is that alpha channel again?
So the idea is if I create an image in Photoshop and I have a transparent background in it, it can ignore all the transparency, which is the alpha channel path. So it can ignore anything that's completely transparent and basically extract out only the pixels that are set to a solid color and use those to determine the shape. So if I drew a complex shape in Photoshop that had a transparent background, you can take all of that and wrap your content around that specific shape that was found in the image.
Seems like you can achieve some of that using like the CSS masking property, right?
Yeah,
Mask
so
stuff that you can create shapes.
exactly. They can go hand in hand. There's some stuff about masking and blend modes on the Adobe Web Platform site as well. Cool.